Welcome back to Fischer Sherwin. So we were discussing the ramifications of Black's move, uh, pawn to c4, 13 c4, and we had showed about the some of the tactical things that Black is going to avoid. One of the things to remember about tactics, I try to tell this to my own friends and people who I'm trying to teach how to play chess, is that tactics are not only about finding ways to punish your opponent, but also avoiding the certain ways that your opponent can punish you. And Sherwin, in playing this move, he plays the best move on the board, even though it's not pretty, simply because he needs to avoid the unpleasantness of the c4 pawn push. So let's look at some of the alternatives that Fischer demonstrates. He says that if he tries to avoid the knight for bishop exchange, so let's say he plays bishop e7, Fischer points out after c4, knight f6, bishop f4, then white has the skewer. He also points out that after c takes d4, knight takes d6, queen takes d6, c4, that c4 push, once again, knight f6, bishop f4, and again, the lineup on the diagonal is unfortunate. So clearly, with c4, Sherwin understands what he needs to be avoiding here. So the game continues. Knight takes d6, queen takes d6, knight g5. Fischer gives this move an exclamation point. I really wasn't so sure. It looks absolutely brilliant in the light of the coming combination, but I thought that something a little bit quieter like queen c2 was better. And the reason why I point this out is because it just so happened that Stockfish agrees with me. But this move, the benefit of this move, it's quiet, it's positional, but I think the brilliance of Fischer's knight g5 comes a lot of how provocative it is. And sometimes when we analyze games with computers, we forget just how much chess is a human game. So after knight g5, Sherwin responds with knight c7, and then Fischer plays queen c2. And so in this case, we see how Black now has to figure out how to respond immediately. Because if we are taking account of the geometric threats, we notice that knight g5 is attacking h7, and queen c2, having just moved to queen 2, is now also attacking pawn h7. So white is threatening mate in 1. And while there are a number of ways to counter that mate in 1, Black has to figure out which way to counter the mate in 1 is best. Fischer points out that f5 can be met with queen e2, which will pick up a pawn. There's this pawn vulnerability on e6 as well as c4. So, for example, queen e2, and then depending on what white can do, there's a lot of different things, but let's just say he tries to defend it again with rook to e6, for example, c4 is still hanging, queen takes c4, or if he tries to defend, say, the b4 pawn, you now have something as simple as and white is clearly better because he has this passed pawn, protected passed pawn, and in the long term, that'll all be very, very difficult. So, looking at a different alternative after queen c2, Sherwin actually plays knight g6, and we'll look at that in just a minute. Fischer also looks up how if g6, then knight e4, queen c7, and then bishop h6, rook d8, queen d2, and then white prepares to exploit the dark square weaknesses of Black's position. Actually, the interesting thing, Stockfish had a slightly different idea as far as this. After g6, it still recommends knight g4, But let's just give an example of if you tried queen c6 instead, how that would be even worse. Knight f6, check. And we see how this position, this is how Stockfish envisions the position. A slightly different way of going about the business. Um, but they're all interesting ideas. Another interesting way it looks at uh, this position is if he tries, say, h6 instead, and then it leads to a similar position they looked at earlier. So there's a lot of different things, and the most simple way of trying to deal with the mate in one, which is of course the knight f6 move to just defend h7. That's the worst move of all, because if you do that, if knight f6, then you are just inviting bishop f4, and then white wins the exchange, if not the rook outright in that position. So none of these are quite as good. So Sherwin goes with knight g6. And at that point, Fischer continues h4. I was very proud of myself to figure out this attack. H4 threatens h5. There's a fairly serious kingside attack that's coming here. And at this point, I'm going to change the view of the screen just a bit. I'm going to put it to board only, so you can't see the annotations. And in this position, Sherwin plays knight f6. And it is in this position, now we're on white's 18th move, and this is the position that Larry Evans at the very beginning of the game says that white hits black like a thunderbolt. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to end this particular video here, and I want you to pause the video and see if you can find Fischer's ingenious tactical combination. At this point, I'd like to give a shout out to Mato, who makes those wonderful short chess lectures on YouTube. And at this point, he will say, "You can now pause the video and look for the killer move." And so I just wanted to give a shout out to Mato in this position and see if you can find white's killer move, which we will start with in our next video, next part on this game.